Dr. Marcos Papadopoulos, I'm glad to have you again on Syriana Analysis. You are a historian, analyst, and author specializing in Russia and ex-Soviet Union. Your PhD is in Russian history. Your latest book is Rise Rossiya, The Return of Russia to World Politics. One of the readers of the book left a review, a beautiful actually review, saying, "This beautifully and intentionally written book provides insight into the other side of the Russian story. Dr. Papadopoulos espouses events that have all but been erased from Western minds by politicians and journalists. Arise Rossiya challenges contemporary Western beliefs concerning the Russian Federation as well as the folly of NATO." I will leave a link to the book in the description below, guys, for you to get a copy if you like. I will also put the link to Dr. Papadopoulos' Facebook and Twitter accounts in the description again. You can directly contact him and purchase the book with a discount if you like it as well. Thank you, Dr. Papadopoulos, for accepting my invitation.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Kavuk, to be back on your wonderful platform.
I think the first and the simple question to begin with is, what's happening in Kazakhstan and why is this sudden mess there?
Allow me, first of all, Kavuk, to set the scene. Russia is the predominant outside force in Kazakhstan, as Russia is the predominant outside force in the whole of Central Asia. However, Kazakhs do not regard Russians as outsiders, because for centuries, Russians and Kazakhs lived, toiled, fought, and died alongside one another. During the Great Patriotic War, which in the West is known as the Second World War, many Kazakhs served in the ranks of the Red Army, and a number of Kazakhs were given the highest Soviet award, namely Hero of the Soviet Union. The closeness between the Kazakhs and the Russians can be described as a fraternal bond which cannot be broken and cannot be disrupted. Indeed, in the March 1991 referendum in the Soviet Union, over 90% of the electorate in Kazakhstan, or to be more precise, the Kazakhstan Soviet Socialist Republic, voted to preserve the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Indeed, the result in the whole of Central Asia was very similar. So in Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan, the electorates there also voted over 90% to preserve the Soviet Union. Following the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Kazakhstan, along with the other Central Asian republics, were shocked to find that they were now independent countries. And the Kazakhs, like the Tajiks and the Uzbeks, were very angry with Russia. They were very disappointed with Russia that they had been separated from Russia. So that is a picture, that is a reality that is rarely, if ever, told in the West. Now, turn into 2022 and the violent protests in Kazakhstan. I am of the firm opinion that the protests, the violent protests, which have seen soldiers killed, police officers killed, violent protesters storming police stations, storming an airport, attempting to storm the parliament, demonstrating a competence in the use of firearms, has been engineered by Western special services to strategically weaken Russia so that Russia has to contend with two exceedingly dangerous fronts on its borders, namely Ukraine and Kazakhstan. Because what we have seen over the last few weeks is Moscow gearing its efforts to focus on Ukraine. And let me assure you, Kevork, and your audience, that the threat emanating from Ukraine, not from the Ukrainian people, from the Ukrainian authorities and their patrons, America, Britain, and the European Union, poses an enormous threat to the security of the Russian Federation. But returning to Kazakhstan, the timing of the outbreak of these violent protests is no coincidence. Coincidences do not occur at such a high level in geostrategic politics. So, as I said moments ago, this is a way of Western special services, by which I mean American special services and British special services, attempting to disrupt, undermine Russia's efforts on Ukraine. And Russia, thankfully, in 2022, is again a superpower. And Russia can contend on more than one front. But nonetheless, this is a danger which Russia will meet head on.
But Dr. Papadopoulos, if this is not a coincidence, don't you also think that this was a failure for the special services of Russia and Kazakhstan to foresee such a violent riots? Because I'm watching the videos on Twitter, and it seems that it's very violent, and it also reminds me of the first days of the so-called Syrian revolution in Syria, when they used to call them peaceful protesters. Now they have AK-47s, the protesters in Kazakhstan, and you can see their cars delivering them ammunition and weaponry. I mean, in my humble opinion, also Russia and Kazakhstan failed in foreseeing such an event, that in the backyard of Russia, where it is you should expect such color revolution attempts again against Russia, right?
I share your sentiments, Kevork, entirely. On the one hand, it is peculiar that the special services of both Kazakhstan and Russia did not foresee these protests, if we can call them protests. In fact, let me reword that. They are an attempt to bring about a coup against President Tokayev, to remove Kazakhstan from Russia's orbit and to place it in the West's sphere of influence, which is something, Kevork, that the West, America and Britain, has been attempting to do since the 1990s, since Kazakhstan became independent. So there has to be, the spotlight has to be placed on the special services of both Kazakhstan and Russia. But on the other hand, we can say with a great degree of certainty that the Kazakhs and the Russians have learned from the lessons of the coup in Ukraine, because it did not take long for President Tokayev of Kazakhstan to request assistance from the countries which form the Collective Security Treaty Organization. And following that request, it did not take long for Russia, which is the de facto leader of the CSTO, to respond favorably and to dispatch its forces to Kazakhstan. Russia responded very, very late to what happened in Ukraine. It was very clear at the end, in November of 2013, that what was occurring in Kiev and in cities and towns in the westernmost part of Ukraine, such as Lvov, was an attempt to engineer a coup. Russia responded far too late, resulting in Ukraine entering the West's orbit. Russia was able to save the Crimea from that disaster. Russia was able to save a third of Donetsk and a third of Lugansk from that disaster. But alas, the rest of the Ukraine finds itself in the West's orbit. So the Russians and the Kazakhs moved very quickly. And the priority at the moment is to ensure that the attempt by the West to orchestrate a coup, to foment civil unrest in Russia's sphere of influence, on Russia's border, is defeated. And then questions will have to be asked. Questions will have to be addressed to Kazakh special services and Russian special services. Mm-hmm. But at the moment, the most important thing is for the CSTO to accomplish its mission. One of the reasons that the CSTO was formed in the first place, and this is going to be the first real test for the CSTO, and time will only tell to see how the CSTO responds to very, very violent, militant protests which have struck Kazakhstan. And let us be very clear, peaceful protesters do not take over parliaments or attempt to take over parliaments. They do not take over airports. They do not shoot dead soldiers. They do not shoot dead police officers. They are not competent in the use of firearms. And what we see in Kazakhstan are militants who are very well trained, very well equipped, very well led, and, as I have previously said, very well trained in the use of weaponry. And the similarities between these militants and the militants which brought about a coup in Ukraine is very, very striking.
Is it enough to send peacekeeping forces to Kazakhstan, as the CSTO now decided? The CSTO is the Collective Security Treaty led by Russia. And do you think there are some similarities between the CSTO and NATO in terms of defending their allies, the least, right? Now, we heard also Armenia is sending some peacekeeping forces, and other nations also expressed their willingness to defend or try to protect the vital sectors in Kazakhstan. Will this be only on a level of peacekeeping forces now, or you also foresee or expect further military intervention in Kazakhstan by the CSTO members to defend their ally?
The CSTO is a military alliance comprising Russia, Belarus, Armenia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan, with two purposes. Firstly, to counter extremism and terrorism of the Islamist kind on the territories of the 6 members of the CSTO. And the second purpose is to counter foreign encroachment on the territory of the 6 members, specifically Western, American, and British. The CSTO has dispatched peacekeeping forces to Kazakhstan, but those peacekeeping forces will counter the violent militants head on. Also, the Russians are sending airborne forces to Kazakhstan to also counter the armed militants who have caused havoc in numerous towns and cities in Kazakhstan. So the CSTO, for some 20 years now, has been training for this day. Mm-hmm. They hold maneuvers on a regular basis, year in, year out. So the peacekeeping forces and the other forces that the CSTO will be deploying there will take on a combative stance against the militants. They will fight them. they will disarm them.
Mm-hmm.
And once the insurgency has been quelled, and it will be quelled, then the peacekeeping forces will turn to safeguarding key installations in Kazakhstan. And those peacekeeping forces will remain in Kazakhstan until the situation there has been stabilized. But we have to bear in mind, Kevork, that the Russian military has numerous bases and installations in Kazakhstan, one of them being a missile testing facility. Russia, of course, also has Baikonur, which is the cosmodrome, Russia's space cosmodrome in Kazakhstan. So the Russian military already has a presence in Kazakhstan. It has had a presence there since Soviet times and since the dissolution of the Soviet Union. But I think, and I suspect you will ask me, what the West's interest in Kazakhstan and indeed in the whole of Central Asia is.
And to be honest, you address the CSTO from a defensive perspective. And the question that comes to my mind is also because I have an Armenian background. I mean, the CSTO, it took them a few hours to meet or decide to send peacekeeping forces to Kazakhstan. Why hasn't the CSTO defended Armenia when it is constantly attacked by Azerbaijan? And bear in mind now, I'm not referring to Nagorno-Karabakh, Artsakh region, which is independent region, not part of Armenia. But Armenia itself now is under constant attacks from Azerbaijan, but the CSTO it doesn't intervene in a decisive way to defend its ally also or member state, Armenia, right?
How Russia sees the tension, the very, very dangerous state of affairs between Azerbaijan and Armenia is as follows. Two members of the Soviet family quarreling with each other, and Russia sees itself as the parent. Armenia has a strategic partnership with Russia. Historically, the Armenians and the Russians are fraternal peoples. But at the same time, Azerbaijan is in Russia's sphere of influence. Azerbaijan is a strategic partner to Russia. Yes, Azerbaijan has a strategic partnership with Turkey. Azerbaijan has a strategic partnership with Israel. But Azerbaijan, especially in the last few years, has found itself all the more embedded in Russia's sphere of influence. In the last few years alone, most of the weaponry which Azerbaijan has purchased from abroad has come from Russia. And indeed, when it comes to Armenia, most of its weaponry comes from Russia. So when Azerbaijan attacked Nagorno-Karabakh last year, the weapons it used were primarily Russian weapons. And the weapons which the Armenians used in defense were Russian weapons. So Russia is not going to take sides, and the CSTO is not going to take sides, because Russia is the de facto leader of the CSTO, and Russia sees itself as the mediator between two quarreling members of the Soviet family.
I just want to mention here something, Dr. Marcos, is when Azerbaijan was coming closer to the Russian orbit and having a better relationship, in 2018, the Armenians did a color revolution, right? Again, and they installed Nikol Pashinyan. And in 2 years, Nikol Pashinyan, he reversed especially the domestic policies in Armenia into neoliberalism. He sacked many senior military and security officials who were tied or close to Russia. He adopted anti-Russian policies when when it comes to voting in international bodies, organizations. So, of course, the Armenian people overwhelmingly feel and believe that they are close to Russia. But at the same time, there is a person or a prime minister at the moment who is trying to have a closer relations to the EU, to the NATO, etc. But the last war, especially when the Armenians lost 70% of Nagorno-Karabakh, it seems that Pashinyan has become too weak to even resist Russia or to be against Russia. So the Russians are, in my opinion, happy now that they have a leader in Armenia who is following like the Russian lead. But at the same time, the Armenians paid a huge price. So what I'm trying to say here, these color revolutions that are mostly funded and there is a long process of social engineering to the people in the post-Soviet Union countries, right, or the ex-Soviet Union countries, and this is all happening through the USAID, the NED, the George Soros organizations, and they're like worms spawning now even in Armenia. So, in my opinion, Russia, on the long term, Russia has to find a cultural pillar for its revival, for its role as a superpower in the region. Because any empire, if we call it an empire, they have a political, economic, military, and also cultural pillars. The Russians, at the moment, they are not able to present themselves also as a cultural power, although they have a very rich culture and civilization. But because the West is so good in marketing its cultural pillar, right, of its empire. Like you go now and just randomly choose children from schools or the youngsters in Armenia or in Ukraine and ask them which one is more attractive to you, Russia or the EU. They will see the EU more attractive because the marketing is very strong there, right? So Russia has, in my opinion, a responsibility also to present itself also as a second option or an alternative for the EU, especially for all these young people who are motivated and they want to join the life and have a good careers and have a good education and etc. And the EU is presenting them that. So Russia is way behind the EU in this, and they have to really be faster if they want to be a superpower. This is my opinion.
One of the major weaknesses of contemporary Russia is that Russia does not have an ideology. What does Russia stand for in the world today? That's very difficult to say. In communist times, of course, the ideology of the Soviet state was Bolshevism, was communism. And that meant that Russia, or the Soviet Union, had an ideology which could appeal to people in all four corners of the world. But what does Russia, how can Russia appeal to people across the world today? There was talk quite some years ago of the concept of sovereign democracy. But the problem with that is that can be applied to any country in the world. And when the Kremlin was speaking of sovereign democracy, they meant ensuring that there would not be foreign interference, foreign encroachment on the territory of the Russian Federation, specifically Western encroachment. But as I said, sovereign democracy is not an ideology. There was some talk of the Russian Orthodox Church being an ideology. Well, the Russian Orthodox Church, Orthodox Christianity is not an ideology, but it will have appeal. It will have appeal in parts of the former Soviet Union, including Kazakhstan. A quarter of the population of Kazakhstan is ethnic Russian. Most of the ethnic Russian population in Kazakhstan is in the north of the country. So the Russian Orthodox faith will have an appeal in parts of the former Soviet Union. It will have an appeal in parts of the Balkans, such as Serbia, Bosnia, Montenegro, and Bulgaria. but that's it. It doesn't have a global appeal. The closest that Russia today has in terms of an ideology, but it's still not an ideology, but the closest that it has is anti-Americanism. Now, that is something that can find adherents across the world, but still, anti-Americanism is not an ideology. It's not good enough. So the Kremlin has to formulate an ideology, because otherwise, as you said, the Americans, the British, and the European Union will keep on winning the marketing war against Russia.
Dr. Marcus, I want to just go back a little bit to the withdrawal of the US occupation forces from Afghanistan. And I want to ask you, do you believe this withdrawal from Afghanistan has paved the way for Washington and its allies to focus their energy and resources against Russia, especially in Ukraine and Kazakhstan, and against China in Taiwan? Do you see the withdrawal from this perspective?
I have to say, Kevork, that according to my understanding, I am the only television commentator who has said and maintains to this very day that the West, America and Britain, has not withdrawn from Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. The military of America has withdrawn. But to control a country, the Americans and the British do not need to have soldiers in that country. They can control a country by controlling its economic infrastructure. They can control a country by controlling its civil service. If we go back to when the Taliban was advancing last summer, the Taliban took just a few weeks, a very short period of time, to conquer Afghanistan, a very large country, a very diverse country, with the presence of the American military there. And there was no confrontation between the Taliban and the American military. That was highly suspicious. Now we have, and since then, the director of the CIA has met with the Taliban leadership in Kabul. His MI6 counterpart, or SIS, which is the proper acronym for Britain's Foreign Intelligence Service, Secret Intelligence Service, has also met with the leadership of the Taliban in Kabul. And we see through American mainstream media and British mainstream media that the Taliban is gradually being portrayed in a more positive light now, portrayed in a way which is meant to say to the American public and the British public that the Taliban has evolved. And today they are an ally against ISIS. There was no need, Kevork, for the Americans to withdraw from Afghanistan. They had not been militarily defeated there. Mm-hmm. And it should also be said that for many years, going back to 2010, the American military had been working with the Taliban. So why would the Americans give up Afghanistan when they were not defeated there? Mm-hmm. They have formed an unofficial alliance with the Taliban. And the Taliban, as part of the agreement, is allowed to govern, to rule Afghanistan. And in return, the Taliban will ensure that the economic infrastructure in Afghanistan remains in the possession of America and Britain, and that Britain and America will retain their strategic influences there, because Afghanistan borders onto Central Asia, which is Russia's sphere of influence. Afghanistan is close to China, the Xinjiang province, which is a restless Muslim province. So the West has not withdrawn from Afghanistan. But turning to Kazakhstan, ever since the dissolution of the Soviet Union at the end of 1991, the West has coveted Central Asia. Central Asia, especially Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, is rich in natural resources and have very significant and large industrial and agricultural sectors. If we take Kazakhstan, for instance, Kazakhstan is immensely rich in hydrocarbons. Indeed, 3% of the world's total of hydrocarbons are in Kazakhstan. So that was an economic draw for America and Britain. But then there is the geostrategic factor for why the West has coveted Kazakhstan and the rest of Central Asia for over 30 years now, because that is on Russia's border. Central Asia can be described as a vulnerable region for Russia because it is susceptible to Islamism. And that's one of the reasons why the CSTO was formed there. And if Islamism takes hold in Central Asia, that could very quickly spread into Russia. It could very quickly spread into the North Caucasus, which, whilst the region has been largely pacified, is nonetheless quite a fragile region. I'm referring to Chechnya, Ingushetia, and Dagestan. And also for the Americans and the British, it is a way of enclosing Russia on one of its southern borders by keeping it away from the rest of the world, keeping it away from, for example, the Indian Ocean. So that is why.
And it also has a border with the Caspian Sea, right? Kazakhstan.
So, sorry, say that again, please.
And the Kazakhstan also has access to the Caspian Sea.
Absolutely. Kazakhstan is one of the countries which neighbors onto the Caspian Sea. And we know that the Caspian Sea is very, very rich in energy, oil and gas. So that is a very major reason as to why the West has sought to interfere in the affairs of Central Asia. In the 1990s, when Russia was on its knees, politically, economically, and militarily, the Americans and the British, and also the Chinese, sought to take advantage of Russia's dire position. And inroads were made by the Americans and the British and the Chinese. But still, the Russians remained the dominant force there. And ever since Vladimir Putin came to power in 2000, Russian predominance in Kazakhstan and Central Asia as a whole has increased dramatically. But it should be said that the Kazakhs are wary of foreigners. That goes for the Americans, the British, and also the Chinese. Yes, Kazakhstan and China have a strong economic relationship with one another, but the Kazakhs do not wish to see Chinese political influence in their country, whereas they are very happy for Kazakhstan to remain in Russia's orbit, in Russia's sphere of influence. That is another reason as to why Kazakhstan is a member of the Russian-led Eurasian Economic Union. And let me tell you, Kevork, and your audiences, that the concept of a Eurasian Union is the brainchild of Kazakhstan's former president, Nazarbayev. He gave a speech in 1994 at Moscow State University. So this is 2 years after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, in which he called for a Eurasian Union between Russia, Kazakhstan, and other former members of the Soviet Union. So this was not the brainchild of Russia. This was not the brainchild of Putin. This was the brainchild of the former Kazakh president, Nazarbayev. So that goes to show how not just the political elite in Kazakhstan, but ordinary Kazakhs regard themselves as brothers and sisters with the Russians. They see the Russians as the senior, the older, the respected brother. Indeed, the current president of Kazakhstan, Tokayev, said only a couple of years ago that the Kazakh people, quote, have faith in the wisdom of the Russian leadership. So Russia is the predominant force in Kazakhstan. There is a potentially serious situation in Kazakhstan now with the violent, appalling levels of protests which we have seen there, which I should say again are not genuine protests. They are an attempt to engineer a coup in the country. But Kazakhstan will remain in Russia's sphere of influence, and it will be very interesting to see going forward what comes of this, because I suspect that Kazakhstan will integrate itself even further in Russia's sphere of influence after this. Because, as I said earlier on in our discussion, 1/4 of the Kazakhstan population is ethnic Russian. Most of the Kazakhstan population speaks Russian, and many ethnic Kazakhs regard themselves as part of the Russian world. And then you have Kazakhs who are part Kazakh, part Russian. They also regard themselves as part of the Russian world. So the West will not succeed in what it is attempting to do in Kazakhstan, like it was never going to succeed in Belarus or Belarusia, which is its proper historical name. But nonetheless, there is a potentially dangerous situation there, and Russia and the CSTO have moved very, very quickly, having learned the mistakes that the Kremlin made in Ukraine, to resolve the matter quickly.
Dr. Marcos, the last question for you, and I want to play the role of the devil's advocate here, because you mentioned that Kazakhstan is a very rich country, especially when it comes to natural resources and gas and oil from the Caspian Sea. And then why Kazakhstan has increased the prices of the energy 50%? 50% is a very huge rate, right? And we should learn at least something from history. The other ex-Soviet countries, such as Armenia, increased the prices of the heating and the electricity in 2016, and there were huge protests called Electric Yerevan. It almost led into a coup again in Armenia, and then they repeated it again in 2018. They succeeded it, right? So the question here is, why aren't the governments in the post-Soviet Union countries or the ex-Soviet Union member countries aren't learning these lessons from each other, especially that the train of the color revolutions hitting these countries one after another? And do you agree that this is a color revolution in Kazakhstan?
First of all, it is not a revolution. It is an attempt to initiate a coup against the president of Kazakhstan and against the government of Kazakhstan. The West attempted a coup in Kyrgyzstan during the 2000s, specifically in the year of 2005. They called that a color revolution. In practice, it was a coup, though Russia was able to limit the damage that the Americans and the British managed to carry out in Kyrgyzstan, to the extent that Kyrgyzstan remained firmly in Russia's orbit. Now, turning to the price of energy, the price of fuel in Kazakhstan, it is an exaggeration to say that the price of energy in Kazakhstan has dramatically risen. I have spoken with a number of people whom I know and trust in Kazakhstan, and they have said it has gone up, and the government needs to account for that. But it has not gone up on the scale that Western mainstream media is saying. As to why has it gone up, we have to take into consideration geostrategic factors. Nord Stream 2, an agreement between Germany and Russia, not an agreement between the European and Russia, as the ignorant fools of Western mainstream media say from time to time. No, Nord Stream 2 is an agreement between Germany and Russia. But this project, which would have ensured that Germany would receive an uninterrupted flow of Russian natural gas, which would be imperative for German industry and imperative for German domestic households, has been suspended by the German government because the German government caved in to pressure from America. And let us remember that Germany is a strategic friend and ally to America. And whilst the Germans will resist to an extent the diktats of Washington, they will relent eventually. Now, as a result of Nord Stream 2 having been suspended or cancelled by the German government, that has made the Kremlin concerned. Because the reason why the Americans called on the Germans to suspend it was because the Americans are trying to asphyxiate the Russian economy. The Russian economy to this day is not a diverse one. The Russian economy, the revenue of the Russian economy is overwhelmingly based on energy sales, followed by defense exports. Well, that's not good enough. That's a major weakness of the Russian economy. So the Americans and the British understand that to derail Russia's status as a superpower once again, they need to suffocate the Russian economy. And to do that, limit the amount of energy that Russia can sell. So as a result of Nord Stream 2 having been cancelled, that has had a knock-on effect on Russian of the energy sector in Russia. Russia also imports energy from Kazakhstan, gas, for example, and then sends it on to Europe, such as Germany. Now, if the Kremlin is having to put up its price for what it imports from Kazakhstan, that means the Kazakh government is going to have to put up the price of energy in its own country. So you can see, Kevork, there is a chain reaction. But I want to emphasize again that the prices in Kazakhstan have not dramatically risen, that the vast majority of the population of Kazakhstan, some 18 million people, live in the country, have not taken to the streets to protest. They do not want to have anything to do with the violence of the militants in Almaty or Nur-Sultan, the Kazakh capital. They regard themselves as part of a family, a fraternal bond with the Russian people and the Belarusian people, and they do not wish to see Kazakhstan leave Russia's influence. Yes, the Kazakh government has to answer the questions as to why it has put the price up. I have given one explanation. Undoubtedly, there are other explanations as well, but there is a knock-on effect of Nord Stream 2 having been cancelled by the Germans.
Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos, I was silent 99% of the time because your insights are very important and I have not much information about Kazakhstan. I learned a lot from you. I thank you for that. I'm sure the audience of Syriana Analysis, they also appreciate your valuable analysis in this regard. That is why I was really interested in hosting you today. I thank you so much for being my guest. And
I just want to say, Kevork, I am exceptionally grateful for the opportunity you gave to me. I believe your channel is absolutely imperative today because there is a war of information being waged, just as dangerous, just as brutal as the economic war which is being waged on countries such as Syria, Iran, and Russia. And your channel is, as I say, imperative because Western mainstream media is neither free nor independent. It is not credible. It has no integrity of any kind whatsoever. And for people to understand the other side to the story concerning Russia, or Kazakhstan, or Belarus, or Syria, or Iran, they have to, people in the world, wherever they reside in, have to have channels like yours So the service you provide is an enormous one. And that is why I am grateful for you having given me another opportunity to share my knowledge and my views with you on your channel and with your audience.
Thank you so much, Dr. Marcus. I really appreciate your compliment and your opinion on Syriana analysis. I can only promise one thing is to continue what we do in our platforms and to develop our work, because we have a message at the end of the day to deliver. We want to show the people the other side of the story in many places of the world, and most importantly, we don't want the people in anywhere in the world to suffer the way we suffered, our grandparents suffered, and now we are suffering again due to these unjust wars imposed on us. And guys, if you want to check and buy the book of Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos, I will put the link again in the description below. Please check it. And if you're new, please consider subscribing. And if you want to support Syriana Analysis, which is an independent platform for political commentary and analysis, you can become my patron. Link also in the description below. And see you next time.